to the Life is an Escape Room podcast, where learning about yourself is an adventure. Here's your hosts, the Eanes escapeletes, Chris and Jeff.
Hello, fellow escapeletes. I'm Chris.
And I'm Jeff, and today we would like to welcome Mairi Nolan. Hello, Mairi.
Hi there. Nice to meet you both.
Very nice to meet you. Before we jump into the topic, can you share a little bit about your background for our listeners and viewers?
Sure thing. So, as you both explained, my name is Mairi, and I'm from London, here in the United Kingdom. So I'm both a game designer and an escape room enthusiast myself. So on the design side, that's about sort of 10 years experience designing games from sort of escape rooms to tabletop games, murder mysteries, anything kind of remotely puzzly, and I probably at least tried to design it in my life. And then more on the enthusiast side, I guess I write about escape rooms all the time. I play escape rooms all the time. I like to do them competitively. Again, pretty much my entire life revolves in some way around escape rooms, which is a lot of fun. So that's me.
Right. Well,
Nice.
excellent.
Yeah, today we're talking about perception. In particular, we see what we want to see in things. And so I'm curious, as a game designer, let's start with that. As a game designer, what are your considerations in that, knowing how people typically perceive things?
Well, when it comes to sort of designing and playing escape rooms, I suppose, I think people in the general public have expectations or perceptions of what a game is going to be or what an escape room is going to be. So probably you've both heard people being a little bit nervous about trying an escape room for the first time because they assume it's going to be horror, or they assume they're going to be handcuffed or locked in kind of thing. So not only from, I guess, a marketing point of view of like, well, shaking that perception and being like, maybe actually come and see what it is before you make those kind of assumptions. But also then once a player gets into a room or gets into an experience, seeing something and being like, I know what that is and I know how it works. So you walk into a room and you see a chair and you say, I know what a chair is. I know exactly how I'm going to sit on this chair and what to do with it. But in team building and in real life, quite often it's not a chair. I mean, for me, my chair is also where I put my dirty laundry. So just shaking those perceptions of what exactly a thing is, whether it's in a game, in a room, or in something that's real life as well. Because it's when things are designed in different contexts. So, for example, a game, things look very differently. I'm sure if we were on a different planet, we would not design chairs the same way they look today. So that's kind of the main thing I think about when I approach perception when it comes to game design and escape room design.
I love that. Do you find that it affects how you view the world and your interactions with others?
I think so, for sure. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my friends and a lot of people in the enthusiast industry kind of laugh because you see a series of sort of dots on a wall, and when you're kind of so used to playing escape rooms and puzzles, you're like, is that Morse code or is that a puzzle kind of thing? Because when you're used to walking into escape rooms, you look for the puzzles in the everyday. And I think on the one hand, it's a fun way to look at life. Everything is a potential game and everything's a potential moment of joy. But on the other side, you can flip that when you come to designing games, right? You can look around you and think, I'm going to design a game today. What have I got? I've got my cup of tea. I think about how I mix the tea leaves. And then you can start to build out a puzzle from that way around. So perception kind of goes both ways in terms of that.
Ooh. I love tapping into your environment to get ideas. That's pretty cool.
Oh, yeah. It's a lot of fun. I mean, right now there's a little puzzle thing going on in the industry called March. Well, I say right now. In every year in March, there's a sort of a puzzle event that goes on, and every day they post a new prompt. And puzzle designers, escape room designers, video game designers from all around the world sort of try and design a little interactive puzzle based on that prompt. And I think there's really interesting ones like light or like wind, I think was one they did this year. So yeah, it's like also kind of like, where does one find the inspiration for building out puzzles and building out games? Inspiration can come from a single word prompt. It can come from a single object. It can come from anywhere, for sure.
When you're designing a game or a puzzle, how much do you take into consideration how people think? Do you kind of break it down and say, this is how I want to challenge them? How do you approach it?
Yeah, I think so. I think when it comes to designing a puzzle for how people think, you can approach it from the point of view of, well, this is how people interact with a particular object. So again, to bring it back to my chair analogy, I put a chair in a puzzle game. What do I expect them to do? I expect them to sit down. And that's totally valid because maybe the puzzle is about sitting down on the chair. Maybe there's a little pressure plate or something. Or maybe it's a little bit more outside the box. Maybe the chair is used for a step ladder to get to somewhere else. And so you can build a puzzle based on how an object or based on how a particular cipher or environmental trigger is supposed to be done in your everyday to day life based on your external knowledge. Or you can try and do what I like to call a bit of a rug pull. So you say, this is what it is, and then they try and do it, and it doesn't work. I wonder why, because they have to think outside the box. And I think a very good puzzle is built when it's outside of the box. You take something for granted as a player, or even as just a person living their day-to-day life, how I use this object in my day-to-day life. And it turns out to be something quite different. And I think that's quite a lot of fun when that kind of thing happens. So that can happen in an individual puzzle or even in the narrative. I mean, you think about movie trailers, right? They love to do a little rug pull when it's like, this is a comedy, and then someone pulls a gun out and you're like, oh, it's not. We like to do that in this industry as well.
Yeah. So I'm curious, as a game designer, I'm wondering, and this is kind of a multi-part question, I guess, if you've ever been surprised in it. Because, I almost think like as you're doing games, you're like, oh, I know what that is or that or that. So maybe could you talk about a time that you were surprised, you were expecting something, maybe set the tone, give us a little bit of immersion into the game as well, but a time that you were surprised and what you learned from it.
For sure, loads of times. I mean, all of my favorite escape rooms and all my favorite video games and moments when I've been surprised. And actually, if I take it logically, all my favorite moments in life have been when I've been surprised. Like coming home after a long day and my partner's planned a surprise party. I mean, it doesn't beat that. Love it. But as a game designer, I guess some of the moments where I've been most surprised are those moments when there's a big moment of twist. So there's one that's coming to mind. And I don't necessarily want to spoil it too much for your listeners, so I'll talk in very vague terms.
Yes.
But there's an escape room company here in the UK called the Panic Room, and they have one particular room called Loop. And I'm sure listeners at home right now would be like, oh, I know this room, because it has one of the best twists. And you get a sort of situation where you go into an escape room, and by this point I've done about 400, maybe 500 if we're counting the digital ones. But I think I know how escape rooms go. You have 60 minutes, you have a bunch of puzzles, you've got to look and you find some keys, blah, blah, blah. And this escape room starts out like that. You're pressing buttons, you're looking for keys and stuff. And at some point in the room, at about the exact halfway mark, the room changes a lot. And what you've just done has a direct impact on how you can then complete the room. So in particular, I like to be fast. Like I like to do this quite competitively. Like I like to have fun, but I also want to try and get the fastest score. And so we were rushing through and we were about 12 minutes until we got that middle point, which I think is a very good time. And this was not what you were supposed to do because we were in a very bad situation because we'd only taken 12 minutes for the first part. And I don't really want to spoil exactly why that is. But put it this way, I think rooms like that kind of tease the enthusiast a little bit because it's like, oh, you thought you were playing in this way? Well, actually, you're playing in another way. And we see it in video games as well. Like the video game teaches you a rule and then flips that on its head and be like, oh, the rule is very different now. And if you try and do it the old way, you'll get it very wrong. And I'm sure that happens in real life as well, but it's just kind of being prepared for that kind of thing as well. Yeah. Never sort of relying on your expectations about a situation and keeping an open mind.
Oh, I love it.
What's your, either an experience or when you're game designing, how do you take into consideration teamwork, like interacting with others? How do you develop a puzzle or a challenge where you have to work with others?
That's a really interesting question, and actually one of the most fun ones to answer, I think, because when it comes to escape rooms are inherently multiplayer experiences. There's very few around the world that will let you play as a single player because a lot of the puzzles within them are always built for two players. And I think that's wonderful. So as a designer of escape rooms, as well as more solo experiences, when I get to design escape rooms, I get to kind of consider that interaction between how do two or more people go into a room. At the most basic level, you have a puzzle that is split into two parts. Maybe one player has to stand in one location. Maybe one player has to like get down on all fours and crawl into a dark space and the other person's shouting at them through the wall. I love to do things like that where the information is split across multiple different locations. And to bring it back to perceptions, I mean, at a very quite literal sense, there's a type of puzzle which I love to include called the anamorphic text puzzle, which is where it doesn't have to be text. It's like where information is split into very visual fragments. And it looks like nonsense until you stand in the perfect location and then everything aligns at a kind of like angle so you can suddenly read it. And whilst they're not necessarily multiplayer puzzles, I've had loads of experiences when I've been staring at like yellow dots on the wall and I'm like, what does this mean? I don't understand. Is it Morse code? Here, my preconceived perceptions, like I see some dots, it's got to be Morse code. And then my friend comes over and they're standing maybe 30 centimeters to the left and they're like, oh, it clearly says like the key is under the pillow. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I think to have sort of multiplayer puzzles are fantastic and there's so much rich opportunity as a designer to include them. But sometimes you also design a solo puzzle and you need multiple brains to solve it because one brain is never quite enough. Everyone looks at things in a different way. So whether a puzzle is specifically designed for a single player or multiple players, it's a lot better to solve collaboratively. And that's the same in every day. Like if whether you're doing marketing or IT or whatever it is, you will approach a problem, you'll approach a task in a very particular way. And sometimes you're stuck in something, or sometimes you're like going down one path a very long way in a particular way of solving this. And all you need is one person to come in and be like, oh, well, did you consider this? And then it's kind of bringing in a fresh perspective. And I think we learn a lot from the collaborative, like cooperative solving of two-player escape rooms or multiplayer escape rooms into our real life in that ways as well, if that kind of makes sense.
Oh, absolutely.
How often do you get to watch people play your games? And does it really teach you something about what you thought was the perception of how they'd solve it and the way they actually went through the thought process?
Oh, yes. So whenever you're designing a puzzle, I would advise every single designer to sit and watch how people play it, because what you think is the correct way to solve a puzzle turns out to not be the correct way to solve a puzzle. Recently, I was doing a big QA of a big board game and we had loads and loads of teams. And I designed this really elaborate puzzle and I was like, oh, this is my magnum opus. This is the best puzzle ever. And I was watching this team play and then they're like, oh, yeah, the answer is, for example, 1, 2, 3. And I was like, yeah, but how did you get that? And they're like, oh, it's simple. And it was the totally wrong way of solving it. But it added an extra layer of nuance. And then that then changed what kind of clues we did, how difficult we thought the puzzle was overall. And I think kind of having that other perception of how other people see and interact with the environments and the puzzles you're creating can really help you tease out exactly what the game is and what kind of a story you're telling in the game as well. So on the one hand, it's incredibly frustrating watch people not able or too quickly able to solve your puzzles, but it's totally invaluable. I would definitely say at the end of every single project I do, or in the middle even, I try and get people playtesting and actually seeing how they solve it, because one person can't design a puzzle in a black box. That you have to go out there and see what the puzzle is in the context and what the game means to other people. It's the same with reading a book, right? What one individual person reads in a book isn't necessarily what the author intends. I remember studying English literature and the teacher being like, oh, here in this paragraph, the author meant this. And then you read another book and it's like, oh no, the author meant this. And nobody really knows. So it's kind of more what it means to you as the reader. Yeah. And it's the same with playing. It's what the puzzle, what the experience means to you.
Right. Oh, nice. Now, do you notice a difference between like enthusiasts, or so for those that don't know, enthusiasts are people who have done a lot of rooms, right? There's a lot of experience there. So experience level essentially versus maybe newbie, you're someone who's done, less than 10 escape rooms. Have you noticed some differences in the way they approach?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the newbies are not, they don't have this pre-existing expectation about how things work. So an excellent example, which is very niche to escape rooms, is, again, Morse code. I don't know why I'm talking about so much Morse code in this podcast, but here we go, Morse code. You go into an escape room and you see what you think is Morse code. And a lot of enthusiasts, once you've done 100 or more rooms, you will probably start to recognize this type of code. And if you really want to, you might even go away and learn it yourself. And so you can walk into an escape room and you would solve it. And quite often that's not the way to solve it at all. Maybe it's not Morse code at all. But the newbie doesn't have that preconceived perception unless they're an expert in World War II. Yeah. They might never have encountered this kind of code in their life. For the listeners, Morse code was that one that you go tap, 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 dot, dot, dash, dash. So coming in with a fresh perspective allows you to be more creative and more free in an escape room as well. I also find that enthusiasts, not always, but quite often will be going for like fast scores, whereas a lot of escape rooms aren't really designed to be sped through. A lot of it's about taking time and enjoying the environment you're in. I see so many times an enthusiast group come through a room and they will not read anything. They will just power through, solve the puzzles, and be out in 30 minutes. And they're like, yeah, we did it. And then you say, did you like the story? And they're like, what story? So I think, but on the flip side to that, if you are if you're a puzzle designer and you're designing something that's particularly complex or multi-steps, and perhaps it's very difficult for the average player, so you give an ability for the average player to bypass it, you lose a lot with the average player. Mm-hmm. So I see some rooms that they have an easy version and a difficult version. And quite simply, the easy version will miss whole parts of puzzles. Mm. And that's the kind of way that some owners can like balance it so that they can still have enthusiast groups that play hundreds or thousands of rooms even and still have a good time. But they can also market towards people who might never have played it, or people who are family groups with children as well. So there's a little bit of a trade-off with both groups, but I think both groups have to be considered when designing a good game. The gold standard would be have puzzles that both groups have fun solving. But sometimes it doesn't quite work like that. Sometimes you do need to cater to your audience a little bit. Yeah,
we've run into that quite a bit. Well, and I can see how, I mean, and we're just like, we think it's genius the way game designers are able to cater to the needs of the very experienced versus no experience, right? Well, and I can see how, too, that relates to real world, right? The more expert we become in something, the more we miss. Because we're looking at things with a bias through that experience. So showing up with curiosity.
I read...
Oh, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think I read something that when someone becomes an expert in anything, they start off thinking they know everything. And then the more they know, they realize how little they know. And then eventually they can work their way up. It's the same for everything. It's the same for every hobby I've ever picked up that I started. And I'm like, yes, I can do this. And then you're like, oh, no, I actually can't do this at all. And it's the same for escape rooms as well, right? Yeah. Probably the first 30 you do, you're like, I'm an expert. And then
I know everything.
Then you have a few and you're like, oh no, you've never seen these puzzles before.
Yep.
Now we have an interesting thing here in the United States where they call them public bookings, where you actually get put in with people that you don't know. Have you played many games and with people that you didn't know, and how does that change how you approach the game?
I'll be honest with you, I haven't actually played that many games in that model. So here in the UK,
lucky.
It's pretty much always private bookings. Yeah. So you can sort of book it as just a team of two and no one else will be in the room with you. Yeah. I think public bookings are very interesting. So later this month, I'm actually going to Canada, and I think they have the same thing in Canada where they have public bookings. And I was only going to go as a team of two with me and my partner, but because it said public bookings, I've deliberately texted a lot of people and be like, please join me. I don't want to be with strangers. So I guess I'll later on this month be finding out exactly what that feels like. But when it comes to more immersive experiences, so ones that are not exactly escape rooms, but maybe it's more theatre, so interactive theatre, you might be in with sort of 10, 20, 30 people. And we have a few things like that here in the UK. We had a show called The Gunpowder Plot, I think it was, a few summers ago. In fact, it might even still be running, but that was sort of teams of 10 people going through a story and solving puzzles and solving things together, but you were in with strangers. And that poses a very different challenge when it comes to sort of designing puzzles, because I think, not having seen it widely, being here in the UK, but I think that people are very hesitant to sort of speak their mind when you're in a group with strangers. Like maybe you think you know how the puzzle works, but you're slightly more fearful of coming over, or embarrassing yourself or saying the wrong thing. So I think people in general are more hesitant. And I think that's the same thing with like in the workplace, for example. Like if I'm sitting in a meeting with 20 people and someone's like, oh, what do we think about this? I'm not going to be the first person to speak up because I don't want to make a fool of myself. But if it was just me and my boss or me and my immediate colleague, of course, you'd be having a back and forth and having a little bit more, I guess, workplace banter. And the same thing happens in puzzles as well. Well, in escape rooms, for example, if I was with a team of just 2 or 3 people, of my closest friends, we'd all be talking over each other. We'd be kind of having a laugh and having fun. But if there was like 6 other strangers in with me, I think I would be much quieter, which is a loss, I think. But then when it comes to being a game designer, if I was tasked with designing that kind of experience, you would, again, have to try and cater to all those people. So making sure that perhaps the room was non-linear. So, for example, the puzzles weren't 1, then 2, then 3, but maybe there were sort of 4 different puzzles that different people could solve. Because then maybe you have the 1 or 2 more louder members of the group kind of monopolizing a few puzzles, but there's always something for someone else to do. Yes. Maybe there's a cheeky bit of anamorphic text on the wall that player can quietly go and stand and be like, oh, I think I noticed something, guys. So it's good to kind of like have that balance, I think. So personally, I'm very interested to see the difference in Northern American escape rooms to the UK, mostly having just played UK ones myself. But it's a very unique set of challenges. Maybe I would like to try designing one myself one day, actually.
Ooh, cool.
I'll pitch some people while I'm out there.
There you go.
Cool. So then before we do get to your final piece of advice, can you share any of your products or services you want our listeners or viewers to know about, and then how to access them?
Sure. So as mentioned, I am a game designer by trade. I primarily work in tabletop puzzle games, video games, and escape rooms, though less so since lockdown, because I think escape rooms are slightly less in the boom phase of their ideation. But if anyone would ever like to come and hire me or talk about escape rooms, talk shop about puzzle design, talk about Morse code, talk about tables, chairs, I am all ears. So my website is marispaceship.com. That's MAIRI and then the word spaceship. That's my portfolio, although a little bit work in progress at the moment. And then more on the writing side, I also write for Escape Industry News, which is a monthly newsletter about global English language escape industry themes. So that's escapeindustry.com. And finally, sorry, so many promotions.
This is awesome.
Finally, I write about escape room news in the UK. So that's more reviews, blog type content. So I have a team of 8 people here in the UK, and our goal is to play every single escape room in the UK. And together we write about all the different escape rooms, themes, trends we come across. It's very UK and Europe specific, but if you guys are interested, if your listeners are traveling to the UK and want the best recommendations, you can find us at theescaperoomer.com. So theescaperoomer.com. I think that's everything.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And what's your final piece of advice, just on things that you've learned and pieces of advice that you would give to our viewers and listeners?
My personal piece of advice definitely relates back to playing escape rooms itself, because that's what I'm into. But I would advise anyone who perhaps hadn't played an escape room before, or maybe they have, but they play it in a particular way. Whatever kind of player you are, I would say leave your perceptions at the door and suspend your disbelief when you go into an escape room. So whether you're like me and you're trying to get the fastest time, or whether you're just there to have a good time with your friends, there's always something new to encounter. So it might be a puzzle you spot and you're sure you know how it works, but in that moment, by jumping to a conclusion, you might miss out on the magic of actually figuring something out and trying something new. And you might waste your time trying to be like, oh, I know how this works. And it doesn't work like that at all. So in terms of just being better at escape rooms or enjoying escape rooms more, it's important to just think outside the box and treat every experience as if it was your very first. And I think that's good advice for life in general. Go into life with a sense of wonder and don't second guess what's happening. Don't judge a book by its cover. Just suspend your disbelief and have a lovely time.
Oh, that's wonderful advice. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Want to learn more about the Eanes escapeletes, buy the book, or read the blog? Visit lifeisanescaperoom.com.